Welcome back, everybody. We're going to dive into the presidency of George Washington. Write that title down, kids. Thanks for being here. Landman flipped history. Let's dive in. So we're going to start, as always, kids, with our template. Good techniques, yes. Pausing, rewinding, and good listening so that we can get those answers out of the video, all right? And if you're listening, you're going to get most of that story really well the first time, okay? Now, we're going to start with our vocab. So here's our vocab. Let me pronounce these for you one time. 1, domestic. 2, precedent, not to be confused with president. 3, inauguration. 4, cabinet. 5, tariff. 6, import. Pause the video, write those down. All right, you're back. So the big questions for this lesson is, why was George Washington's presidency such an important presidency for the future of America? What accomplishments did he have? What kind of problems did he face? And what kind of advice did he leave for us as Americans? We're going to dive into these. Deep dive. Here we go. Off the deep end. Let's rewind really quick. So leading up to George Washington's presidency, remember that we had gone through a revolution where we broke up with our mother country, England, and we won that revolution, right? And then we have our first American government called the AOC, and it's kind of weak and it's mostly a failure because Daniel Shays' rebellion proves that the government is not strong. And then we get, of course, the Constitutional Convention, where the framers or the men of the Constitution rewrite government and create a new government so that we can be strong in our rule of law. And so let's fast forward now. We are going to begin with something called the Early Republic era. Now, the Early Republic era shows us the growth of our new nation. That's why we call it the Early Republic, because America is now going to start to grow. So now we get to Mr. Great Rockstar Washington. There are some themes here that we're going to see in this presidency. Now, there's going to be some ideas that are going to keep revolving. Number 1 is a precedent. It's an example of how Mr. Washington is going to operate as a president. And then we're going to see the economy, economia, money. We're going to see the economy start to grow. And then we're going to see domestic issues. Domestic is a word that means home. So at our home country in America, we're going to start to see some home domestic issues that Mr. Washington is going to address. Now, he's a freaking rock star. We can talk in class, all the cool stories and details. So definitely ask your questions about him on your paper if you want to. Okay, so let's start with his inauguration. So on April 30th, 1789, George Washington was sworn in as the first president, and he was unanimously chosen by the delegates at the Electoral College. Now, sworn in is just a way of saying that he's making a promise to be loyal to the job, whether it's in a law court or starting a new job. So he's swearing himself on a book by saying, I will do my job to the best of my abilities. So his inauguration is that beginning. Now, what did Mr. Washington do that is so important for other examples to follow from? Now, when we look at him before the presidency, he had some really big highlights. He was the general and commander of the Continental Army. He was also in the House of Burgesses in Virginia. So those are really monumentous things that he did. But then he becomes the president. And then he really starts to set the track for others to follow, right? He is inaugurated. He helps create the federal court system, all right? He stops something called the Whiskey Rebellion. And not only that, he starts to set all of the precedents, which are the examples that others can follow as president. And he did have a lot of them, too many for me to list on one list. Here's just some of the highlights. Now, let's look at one precedent that's really big. He creates a cabinet. It's a group of advisors, and it's called a cabinet. It doesn't mean a literal cabinet. It just means a group of advisors. So let's start with these two guys. They're really important. Secretary of State is Mr. Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of State is the person in charge with dealing with other countries. The Secretary of Treasury is money. That was Alexander Hamilton. Now, the other two are Mr. Randolph and Mr. Knox here that you can see for yourself. But we're really going to focus on that Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury. We're going to focus on Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton for sure, okay? Now, these advisors, they helped him make important decisions. That's why he assembled these men to work with him like a group. So he didn't work in isolation. Now, there's Mr. Obama with his cabinet. It's just a tradition, right, that Mr. Washington said. That's a real cabinet. It looks huge, by the way, in that picture, all right? Now, Executive, there he is. In case you missed him, there's Mr. Obama. He's the executive of the president, right? Now the president has a second in command. So who was America's first vice president or number two? Who? Here we go. Do you know? It's got to be this guy. If you didn't know that, little trivia for you right there. John Adams was George Washington's vice president. Remember him? He was cousin of Sam Adams from the American Revolution. Little tidbit. Okay, he's going to be the president on the next go round that we'll study. All right. Now, another first for the presidency of George Washington was that he helped create the federal court system with the Judiciary Act of 1789. So in other words, this law helped create how the government was going to have courts. Now, the most important court that we're going to look at in class is the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. It has 9 justices, all right, which as a matter of fact, there's a change happening right now with that. So Mr. Washington understood how important it was for the government to have the judicial branch, and he helped create that with this act. Now, issues that start to rise up in his presidency, we're going to look at those. Now, the first issues are called domestic, meaning at home issues. And also outside of home, we have other countries or foreign issues. We're going to look at those too. So we're going to compare domestic home, foreign outside, okay? So let's start with domestic issue number 1. Take a look at that picture. What do you think Mr. Washington's dealing with there? It's kind of obvious, right? So there is a war debt. America is still in massive debt after the American Revolution. America needed money, dinero. So this is going to bring in this awesome guy. You recognize him? That's Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury. He was in charge. We're helping America get out of debt. And he had a plan to do that. So his solution was for America, the government, the federal government, to create a national bank that the federal government would run. This would be a major power to the federal government. A huge deal because the government is going to be in charge of a banking institution. Now, unfortunately, there was going to have to be a way for America to make money, and that means a tariff. So what is a tariff? A tariff was a tax on any item that could be brought into the United States. So Hamilton wanted to tax any import or good brought into the United States. Now, he also wanted to add something called an excise tax. Do you see that on the last bullet? It would be a tax on luxury items. Think about it, an iPhone, Gucci shoes, right? Handbags, cars, all luxury items. So these items back then would have been taxed by the excise tax. And that meant that that money was going to go to that bank, right? And since that bank was owned by the federal government, America could make money. Now, one product ends up being a really big product to make money off of on that excise tax, and that was liquor. Now, liquor was really popular, and it was also more expensive. So taxes on liquor could help bring more money. But the guys, the families that were making that liquor, which were the farmers, were very affected by that tax because they were poor. And they had to grow those crops to sell the liquor. And so they felt like they were getting abused by the government, further making them feel like they were not a part of government in a fair way. So this is going to lead to a problem at home, right? This tax, this Hamilton tariffs and taxes plan. So these taxes on the liquor create something in 1794. That's an event that George Washington had to help fix, which was called the Whiskey Rebellion. Whiskey is a liquor, by the way. So farmers in Pennsylvania were threatening and attacking tax collectors. Now, if you remember your history a little bit, there was another rebellion with farmers that was kind of bad, right? Are you remembering the one? So Mr. Washington, long story short, he tries to use peace, but he has to ride out himself personally to Pennsylvania with 12,000 militiamen, and he has to put it down. He has to put that rebellion down. But by the time he gets there, the word has spread that Washington's on his way with the quote unquote army or militiamen, and those rebels, they just scatter. Those rioters scatter. There is no rebellion, right? Because George Washington is kind of the man and he's tough. So what does this mean? This means that George Washington was basically coming out in favor of putting rebellion down. And he says, we're not going to do this Shays Rebellion. Remember Daniel Shays? Remember how he tried that rebellion in Massachusetts when he was getting those farms taken from him. Well, Washington basically says that's not happening. No way. So by putting this rebellion down of the whiskey farmers, President Washington was proving that the federal government was strong. Don't mess with America's authority. We are for real. Yeah. So that leads us to the one big issue, domestic home issue that I want to focus on a lot, which is political parties. A rivalry between two men with two different visions for America started to form. So every problem faced by the President Washington had these two men. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about these two guys right here, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Now, we remember from our learning that Hamilton was a Federalist. He was a Federalist, which means that he believed in a strong government. Now, Jefferson was an anti-Federalist, meaning that he was for states' rights. He was for states' rights. So this is going to lead to a little bit of a name change that you got to know. The Anti-Federalists were going to call themselves now Democratic Republicans. So we're going to call them from now on Democratic Republicans, okay? So these two men, let's focus on them. What's going on with these two men and their beliefs? Well, President Washington had to make a lot of decisions, and he had to go to these two men, okay? They were in his cabinet. Now, the belief systems leads to something that is called a political party. Now, this made it really hard to govern sometimes. So the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were very divided. Now, the beliefs on government were obvious, right? So strong states' rights for the Democratic Republicans and strong central government. But what about the taxes? How did they feel about the economy? Well, the Federalists were for higher taxes. They liked that. But the Democratic Republicans, they wanted lower taxes because they represented poor people in the South. What about that national bank that Hamilton wanted to create? Well, the Federalists wanted the bank, right, to make money, but the Democratic Republicans wanted to follow the Constitution, which says no bank. See the differences starting to really build here? We're going to study these in class a lot, okay? Now, let's go outside of the country a little bit for a big problem that is brewing. The French War and the French Revolution. Now, the country of France was in massive turmoil because they were overthrowing their own king and fighting a war against Great Britain at the same time. So Mr. Washington goes to his cabinet and says, guys, what should we do about this French Revolution and this French war that they're having with Great Britain? Well, Jefferson and Hamilton, of course, with their two different opinions, they show up. Well, how do you think they feel? Who's for France? Who's for Great Britain? Who's for war? Who's against war? Can you guess? So Jefferson comes out and says, I am for independence, and I believe France deserves their independence. We need to defend France, and we need to help them with their war. And we need to help them with their new government. And of course, Hamilton's on the opposite side. He says, we do not want America to go to war because it's going to cost too much money, and America needs money, so no war. So who does Washington decide with? Any guesses? So Washington comes out and says, Hamilton is right. We should not be interfering in France's problems or with Great Britain because America should become stronger. So he issues an order that we're going to call neutrality, meaning we're not going to choose a side. Neutral. We're not going to choose a side. Washington kept this idea in his presidency for a long time. So this brings us to the end. President Washington is going to give his farewell speech after 8 years in office. So this wisdom of his goodbye speech was a lesson to all of us for a better government. Now, there's two bits of information that still ring true today that we really want to listen to in his farewell speech. Number one, here is this one piece of advice. Stay away from political parties. Look at that bullet. Factions, groups are dangerous because they will split the nation and will lead to ruin. So he's being very clear. So what does that mean? Did he not like these men? Yes, of course he did. He trusted them with decision making, but he did not like the division. He did not like how they were separate like that. Now, big problem for Mr. Washington. And what was the other little piece of advice? Well, avoid permanent foreign political alliances. Look at that bullet that says foreign influence is harmful. Look at the yellow. What is he saying? Remain neutral. We need to stay away from permanent foreign alliances. So in other words, if other countries come calling, we're not going to get involved with them. We can work with them, we can trade with them, we can sell them goods, but we're not going to become like super best friend partners with other foreign countries. Is this good advice, you think? to stay away from political parties? Do you think this is good advice to avoid foreign governments? Well, that was Washington's belief. So that brings us to the end of the lesson. We will see you in class. Get your answers down. You guys have been awesome. Hasta luego, everybody. All right, bye.